The family gathering was in full swing. Laughter echoed through the house as the usual chatter of relatives filled the air. The kitchen, the epicenter of the celebration, had become the unofficial meeting spot for the woman and her younger brother. They had always shared a special bond, one built on years of inside jokes, playful teasing, and countless memories. Today, however, the usual warmth felt just a little too charged, especially with the growing number of drinks making their rounds. "Remember when we used to sneak into Mom's room to steal her perfume?" her brother asked, grinning, as he poured himself another glass of wine. She laughed, her tipsiness making the memory seem even more vivid. "You always smelled like an overripe strawberry afterward." He chuckled, leaning back against the counter, clearly enjoying the moment. "Hey, I looked good, didn't I? Even back then." She raised an eyebrow. "Well, let's not get carried away." But there was something in his tone, something in the way he was looking at her that made her pause. She had always found him charming, but the older they got, the more she started to notice that charm in a way that felt different. She shook the thought away. A couple more drinks later, the conversation turned to more serious matters, or at least as serious as their drunk minds could handle. "So tell me," her brother said, tilting his head, "what's it really like, being married?" She blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" The whole sex thing, intimacy. "Does it get boring?" he asked, a mischievous grin creeping across his face. She nearly choked on her drink. "You're asking your sister this?" Her voice cracked with laughter, but she couldn't help but notice how his grin didn't falter. There was something in his eyes, a glimmer she couldn't quite place. "Why not?" He shrugged nonchalantly. "You're the expert. You've been married for, 5 years now? You must have some experience." "Yeah, well," she said, still laughing nervously, "it's not all it's cracked up to be." She was trying to keep things light, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that their conversation had shifted in an odd direction. "I bet," he muttered, almost to himself. Then, to her surprise, he leaned in just slightly. "But honestly, I always thought you were, pretty hot. I mean, you're my sister, but you're not, like gross or anything." She froze. The words had come out of nowhere, and they hung in the air like a thick fog. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Was he joking? Was this just the alcohol talking? Thanks," she managed, forcing a laugh. But the awkward tension lingered. The playful camaraderie they'd always shared suddenly felt different. Like they were teetering on the edge of something they shouldn't even be talking about. "Don't get me wrong," he continued, his voice lowering slightly. "I'm not saying I just think it's funny how people see family differently. Like how you never really think of someone as attractive because they're family. But then, sometimes you do." She didn't know what to say. Her heart was racing, and she suddenly felt flushed. She'd always thought he was handsome, but never like this. Never with this undercurrent. He wasn't really flirting, was he? "Well," she stammered, "I don't think that's really appropriate." "Yeah, no, it's probably not," he said, as if it was just another silly thought that had crossed his mind. He took a deep breath and straightened up. "Anyway, forget I said anything." But it wasn't that easy. Her mind kept replaying the comment. She couldn't ignore how her heart had skipped a beat when he said it, how his words had somehow hit her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She tried to dismiss it, to laugh it off, but the rest of the evening felt off. The rest of the night blurred into a haze of laughter, games, and family. But she couldn't stop thinking about it. She caught herself glancing at her brother more than once, her thoughts wandering to places they shouldn't. He didn't seem bothered, though. In fact, he acted as though nothing had changed. He was his usual self, teasing, joking, the same charming guy he'd always been. After dinner, as everyone settled into the living room, someone suggested playing a game of truth or dare. The alcohol had definitely kicked in, and no one was in a mood to shy away from the absurdity of it all. She found herself sitting next to her brother, and the game began. It was silly at first. Dares like, "Eat a spoonful of hot sauce," and Do your best dance impression. Had everyone laughing. But then it came time for her turn. Truth or dare? One of the cousins asked. Truth, she answered, eager to keep it light. All right. Her cousin grinned mischievously. Who do you think is the most attractive person in this room? Her eyes darted nervously to her brother, who was sitting just a few feet away. The alcohol was making her thoughts swim, and she didn't want to think too hard about it. I guess I'd say, everyone's pretty cool. Come on, her cousin pressed. Give us something good. She looked at her brother again, almost by accident. He raised an eyebrow at her, his smile sly. Without thinking, she blurted out, My brother. Everyone went silent. It wasn't that big of a deal, really, but the room seemed to freeze. She immediately regretted it. Her brother looked at her in a way that made her stomach flip. She laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but the damage had been done. Oh? That's interesting, one of the relatives said with a teasing grin. You two have always been close, huh? Her brother just chuckled, but there was something in his laugh that made her skin crawl, like he was enjoying the awkwardness more than he should. All right, she said, trying to move the game along. Let's keep going. Who's next? But the damage had already been done. The playful tension between them had shifted. Every time their eyes met, it felt charged, loaded with something neither of them wanted to acknowledge. As the night dragged on, she found herself stealing glances at him, wondering if he was still thinking about what had been said. It was impossible not to notice how close they were sitting now, how their hands brushed against each other too often. The game ended, and everyone began to disperse, but the sense of unease didn't go away. She and her brother lingered behind, both acting as if nothing had happened, but the air between them felt thick. Hey, he said, breaking the silence. I didn't mean to make things weird earlier. It's just the drinks, you know? She nodded, a tight smile on her face. Yeah, me either. But even as she said the words, part of her knew it wasn't just the drinks. Something had shifted. Something deeper, something neither of them was ready to admit. And as they sat there, in the aftermath of their harmless flirtation, she couldn't help but wonder, was it really harmless, after all? The night carried on, but the tension between them remained, simmering beneath the surface. The night had settled into a drunken haze, and the game of truth or dare had shifted into something even more ridiculous. Everyone was tipsy, and the air was thick with awkward energy, especially between the woman and her younger brother. Their playful comments from earlier still hung in the air, and with every passing minute, the tension seemed to grow, like a pressure building behind closed doors. All right, someone called out, slurring their words. Truth or dare? Her brother, now clearly feeling the effects of the alcohol, leaned back in his chair with a smirk. Dare, he said confidently, as if daring the universe to throw something wild his way. All right, the cousin grinned. I dare you to kiss your sister on the cheek. The room went silent. A few nervous giggles broke the tension, but both siblings felt the weight of the dare in ways they hadn't expected. He looked at her, the same mischievous grin still on his face, but now it seemed less playful and more loaded. The alcohol buzzed in her system, making her feel lightheaded and oddly more aware of him than she had ever been before. Without breaking eye contact, he leaned in and kissed her cheek. It was innocent, a quick peck, but for some reason, it lingered in her mind far longer than it should have. She could feel his lips, soft against her skin, and a strange flutter ran through her chest. Your turn, he said, pulling back, his voice slightly hushed. His eyes were full of mischief, but there was something else there too. Something she couldn't quite place. She cleared her throat, trying to push the odd feeling aside. Truth, she answered quickly, wanting to steer the game back to safer waters. But of course, it didn't work that way. Her cousin grinned, clearly enjoying the moment. What's the most embarrassing thing you've ever done with your brother? Her heart skipped a beat. The question was innocent enough, but the implications felt suddenly loaded. She looked at her brother, who was watching her intently. The game was becoming more uncomfortable by the second, but there was an undeniable undercurrent of something else, something more than sibling rivalry. Nothing really embarrassing," she replied too quickly, her voice wavering. She was lying, of course. She couldn't count the number of embarrassing things they'd done together growing up, but now it felt wrong to bring them up. Her brother's eyes narrowed slightly, and the corner of his mouth twitched into a smile. "Come on, there's gotta be something. You've always been the one to drag me into stupid stuff." She laughed nervously. "Yeah, but that was when we were kids. Things change." "Yeah," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "They sure do." The comment was so quiet, so casual, but it hit her like a ton of bricks. She didn't know what to make of it. Was he talking about their relationship? Or was he just speaking in the abstract? Either way, it felt like too much. She shifted in her seat, trying to ignore the heat creeping up her neck. The game continued, but the rest of the dares felt more absurd, less meaningful. No one seemed to care about the actual questions anymore. It was all about pushing boundaries, laughing at awkwardness, and pretending like everything was normal. But with each round, it was harder to ignore the fact that she and her brother had crossed some invisible line. "All right, your turn," he said, slurring his words a little. He leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Truth or dare?" "Dare," she said, not wanting to show any sign of hesitation. She couldn't back down now. Not after everything that had already happened. He grinned, and for a moment she swore she saw something darker in his eyes. "I dare you to kiss me on the lips," he said, his voice low, teasing. The room fell silent again. She stared at him, disbelief creeping into her chest. Her heart was pounding in her ears, and for a second she thought she might pass out. Was this really happening? Was he really daring her to kiss him like that? Her first instinct was to refuse, to laugh it off as another joke, another ridiculous game. But something stopped her. Something inside her, somewhere deep down, urged her to just do it. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe it was the strange tension that had been building all night. Either way, she didn't want to back down in front of everyone. With a shaky breath, she leaned forward. Her lips brushed against his for just a second. The kiss was soft, innocent even, but it sent a shockwave through her body. She pulled back immediately, her face burning with humiliation. Everyone else in the room was laughing, as if they didn't realize how serious the moment had been. But her brother didn't laugh. His eyes lingered on her for a beat too long, and she could see the shift in his expression. It wasn't playful anymore. It was something else, something more dangerous. The tension between them was palpable now. Every glance, every accidental touch felt loaded. When their hands brushed as they reached for their drinks, neither of them pulled away. Her heart raced, and for the first time that evening, she wasn't sure whether to be terrified or intrigued. "All right," she said, trying to clear the air with a forced laugh. "That's enough of this game." But it wasn't over. Not really. The awkwardness lingered in the room, and she could feel it crawling under her skin. She glanced at her brother, and his smile was different now. It wasn't the carefree grin she was used to. It was darker, more intense, and it made her feel both exposed and oddly exhilarated at the same time. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice unusually soft. "Yeah, of course," she replied, but her voice faltered. "Just a little drunk." "Yeah," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "I can tell." And that was it. The rest of the game passed in a blur. The night dragged on, and the family began to disperse, heading off to bed one by one. But she and her brother stayed behind, lingering in the living room, the weight of their shared moments hanging between them like a thick fog. "So, she began, trying to break the silence. "That was fun, huh?" "Yeah," he replied, his voice low. "Definitely something." Either of them laughed. Instead, they just sat there, caught in the aftershocks of what had just happened. The evening had shifted from innocent fun to something far more complex, and neither of them seemed ready to face it. "Look," he said after a long pause, "about what happened. I didn't mean to make things weird. I swear." She nodded, though the words didn't bring her any comfort. Me neither, she whispered, her heart still racing in her chest. The night ended quietly, but neither of them could shake the feeling that things had changed. There was a tension now that hadn't been there before, an unspoken understanding that neither of them could ignore. And as the last of the family trickled off to their rooms, she and her brother were left alone, standing on the edge of something neither of them could name. Neither of them knew what would come next, but they both knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. The next day, the family had mostly gone home, and the house was eerily quiet. She sat in the living room, nursing a coffee, trying to shake off the awkwardness from the night before. The light from the windows streamed in, warm and peaceful, but it felt like it was all in contrast to the heavy feeling in her chest. The kiss, the dare, everything that had happened seemed to echo in her mind, and no matter how hard she tried to push it away, it lingered. Her brother walked into the room, looking as casual as ever. His hair was still a little messy from sleep, and he wore the same grin that had been on his face the night before. But this time, there was something different about him. Something deeper. He didn't sit right away, just stood there, a little too still. "Morning," he said, his voice casual but with an undercurrent she couldn't ignore. "Morning," she replied, forcing a smile. "Did you sleep okay?" "Yeah," he said, sitting down next to her, but just a little too close for comfort. "It's just, well, I couldn't sleep much. Had a lot on my mind." She didn't look at him. Instead, she stared into her cup, stirring it absent-mindedly. "Yeah, me too. About last night," he said after a moment, his voice soft, almost hesitant. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew this was coming. There was no way they could just pretend nothing had happened. "Look," she said, quickly glancing at him. "We were drunk. It was a stupid game. We were both just messing around." "Yeah," he agreed, but he didn't seem convinced. "But I don't think I was just messing around." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her stomach twisted in a way she hadn't expected. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, she noticed how different he seemed. His eyes weren't just playful anymore, there was something else in them. Something that made her feel like the ground beneath her was shifting. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice shaking a little, despite her best efforts. He took a deep breath, his fingers drumming on the edge of the coffee table. "I mean, I know we've always had a close relationship. But last night it felt different. Don't you think?" She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Maybe. But that doesn't mean we should. I'm not saying we should do anything about it." He cut in, his voice suddenly more intense. I need you to know that I don't regret what happened." Her breath hitched. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. The thought that he didn't regret it twisted something deep inside her. She had expected him to brush it off, to play it off as just a weird, drunken mistake. But now, she wasn't so sure. "Why would you say that?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice a little rough. "But when I kissed you last night it felt right. Not in a weird way. Just different." The room was so quiet now that she could hear her heartbeat in her ears. She didn't know what to say. It wasn't supposed to be like this. They were family. They were supposed to be close, but this? This was something else. And as much as she wanted to shut it down, something inside her told her not to. "I don't want to make things weird," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But it already is, isn't it?" He didn't respond right away. He just sat there, staring at her, his expression unreadable. She could see the conflict in his eyes, and it made her feel like she was on the edge of something dangerous. "Maybe," he said finally. "But sometimes things get weird. Doesn't mean we can't figure it out." Her heart thudded in her chest. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words. The awkwardness from the night before hadn't dissipated, it had only grown stronger. But now, there was something new, something even more unsettling. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He hesitated. Maybe. But I don't think there's much to say. I think we both feel it. We're just not saying it. She swallowed hard. What do you mean? He leaned closer, and she could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the remnants of alcohol from the night before. I mean that there's a part of me that wants to explore this. To see where it could go. But I don't want to do anything that'll make you uncomfortable. So I'm asking you now, what do you want? The question hung in the air, an impossible one. She felt paralyzed, unable to respond. What did she want? The idea of being with him in any way that wasn't familial was so foreign, so wrong, that it made her stomach turn. But at the same time, there was something undeniably thrilling about it. Something forbidden. She couldn't deny the spark that had ignited between them. And that terrified her. I don't know, she said, her voice barely audible. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. Neither do I, he admitted, his voice softer now. But I know that what we did, it felt real. It didn't feel like just a mistake. Her chest tightened. This was wrong. This was all wrong. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she didn't know what was right anymore. She had always been so sure about who she was, what her relationships were, but now everything was in question. And it scared her. I think we need some time, she said finally, standing up abruptly. We need to figure out what we're doing here. What this is. He nodded, looking slightly relieved. Yeah, that sounds fair. She walked away, trying to escape the tension that still crackled in the air between them. She couldn't be around him right now. Not like this. Not when everything felt so complicated. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the distance between them would never be the same again. And neither of them knew how to undo what had already happened. The rest of the day passed in a blur, either of them talking much. She stayed in her room for most of it, trying to make sense of everything that had unfolded. Her thoughts were jumbled, filled with confusion, desire, guilt, and fear. She couldn't look at him the same way anymore. She couldn't look at herself the same way either. When evening fell and everyone else had gone to bed, she found herself standing at the edge of her brother's door. Her hand rested on the knob, but she didn't turn it. She wasn't ready for what would come next. Not yet. She just hoped that when she was, he would be there, ready to figure it out with her. The days that followed were filled with an eerie tension that neither of them could escape. She tried to convince herself that things were fine, that the awkwardness was just a temporary byproduct of too much alcohol, too much closeness. But the truth was, everything had changed. They hadn't talked about what happened since that morning, and neither seemed eager to address it, as though speaking the words out loud would make it all real. One evening, she found herself alone in the living room again, trying to bury herself in a book to avoid the constant thoughts swirling in her head. But it wasn't working. She couldn't focus. The way he looked at her, the words he had said, replayed in her mind over and over again, making it impossible to think about anything else. It wasn't until she heard footsteps behind her that she snapped back to reality. She turned around and saw him standing there, looking almost too casual, as if nothing had happened between them. But his eyes gave him away. They were darker, more intense than she remembered. Hey, he said, leaning against the doorframe. Mind if I join you? She hesitated. The last thing she wanted was to sit in the same room with him and pretend everything was normal. But there was something magnetic about him now, something she couldn't ignore, even if it terrified her. Sure, she said, trying to sound casual, though her voice cracked slightly. He took a seat next to her, but again, just a little too close. She could feel the warmth of his body next to hers, and it sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. She tried to pretend it wasn't bothering her, tried to focus on her book, but it was impossible. Every breath he took seemed louder than the last. The space between them seemed to shrink, and she could feel her own pulse quickening. So, he said, breaking the silence, I've been thinking about what you said the other day. About needing time. Her heart raced at the mention of it. She hadn't realized how much she'd hoped he'd let it go. But it was clear now that he wouldn't. Yeah, she said, forcing the words out. I need to figure things out. You know, this isn't something I've ever really thought about before. He nodded, his eyes still on her, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I get it, he said softly. I do. But that doesn't change what we did. What we felt. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. He was right. What they had done wasn't just a mistake, and they both knew it. But that didn't make it okay. Nothing about this was okay. You keep saying what we felt, she said, her voice shaking slightly. What do you mean by that? He paused, then leaned a little closer, his voice lower now, almost like a secret shared between them. I mean that what happened wasn't just some accident. It wasn't just the alcohol or the game. It felt real. She couldn't look at him anymore. His words were too much to handle. They were too honest, too raw, and they made her feel exposed in a way she wasn't ready for. You can't be serious, she whispered. I am, he said, his tone unwavering. I know this is wrong. I know it's not what we were ever supposed to be. But it's what we are now. The room seemed to close in around her. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the air grew thicker. She couldn't breathe. She wanted to run. She wanted to pretend that none of this was happening, but she couldn't. The undeniable truth of his words was staring her in the face, and she didn't know how to escape it. You're my brother, she said, almost pleading. This isn't something we can just ignore. I know, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. But the thing is, we can't just pretend it didn't happen either. What we have, it's not something that can be forgotten. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I don't know what to do with this, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to fix this. How to go back to the way things were. You don't have to fix anything, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. We don't need to go back to anything. What happened between us doesn't have to define us. But I think we should at least acknowledge it. We can't just let it hang in the air and pretend it didn't change everything. His words hit her like a punch. He was right. They couldn't just ignore it. The truth was, nothing was the same anymore. Every look they shared, every word they spoke, was now tainted by the knowledge of what had happened between them. I don't know if I'm ready for that, she said quietly, barely above a whisper. He nodded, though his expression was unreadable. I understand. But I think we both know that we can't keep pretending that this didn't happen. We can't keep acting like nothing's changed when everything has. She closed her eyes, the weight of his words sinking in. She wasn't sure what she wanted anymore. The truth was, she was scared. Scared of what this meant for them, for their relationship, for everything they had built. But more than that, she was scared of how much she was beginning to crave it. The idea of him. The thought of crossing that line. The thought of exploring what they had started, even though it felt like the worst possible thing they could do. Maybe we don't have to figure it all out right now, she said, finally meeting his gaze again. Maybe we just need to take it one step at a time. He didn't respond right away. He just stared at her, his eyes soft, but intense, as though he was weighing her words, deciding what to do next. I can do that, he said finally, his voice steady. One step at a time. But just know this, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. And I'm not going to act like nothing's changed. Because everything has. She nodded, unsure of what else to say. The silence between them stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, like the calm before a storm. They both knew that what they were about to face wasn't going to be easy. But it was something they had to face together, whether they were ready for it or not. And as the evening wore on, and the tension between them hung heavier than ever, one thing was certain: there was no going back. Whatever was coming next, they were in it together. And neither of them could predict how it would end. But they both knew it was only the beginning.